Shekmaisky, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the keynote session, where this session we will hear a presentation about Indigenous science and Indigenous value systems. I'm really looking forward to this session. I'll let Dr. Hernandez introduce herself, but please add your questions directly to the question and answer box, and we will get to them during the later portion of the session.
So Wendell Padichi Biguri, thank you for having me here today, and I will share my presentation now. Okay, so it's a privilege and honor to be presenting this morning's keynote. Before I begin, I would like to ask for the permission of our elders who are present here today in the virtual audience so that I can be able to speak in front of you all. Our elders are the caregivers and our teachers who teach us our first relationships with Mother Earth, cultures, and communities. And I would like to acknowledge their role in our communities. So today's presentation is on relationships to heal our Indigenous lands. And I am Dr. Jessica Hernandez. So with this presentation, I'm using Mentimeter. So if you can either scan the QR code or type in www.menti.com and type the code 43877215, you should have access to the presentation. So I'm going to give everyone a couple of seconds to access the presentation because there will be an opportunity for the audience to also participate in some of the questions. Okay, thank you. So today I would like to also acknowledge the Indigenous lands where I'm calling from. Today I'm calling from the shared waters and lands of the Coast Salish people, also known as Seattle, named after Chief Sealth. So I would also like to give the audience the time to acknowledge the Indigenous lands they're calling from. But it's important to remember, as we heard in the first presentation, that land acknowledgements are a first step in dismantling those false and partial historical accounts and narratives that we have learned through our entire education. And that it's important that everyone learns the local Indigenous histories that are often ignored, erased, or hidden from the dominant historical accounts that we still have today. So find ways to support local Indigenous communities' efforts, as Indigenous communities are leading many movements that do not all garner media attention. So make sure to immerse yourself in learning not just whose Indigenous lands you're standing on, but also about the Indigenous peoples whose lands you're occupying. So take the next 10 seconds to type in and acknowledge the Indigenous lands you're joining us from today. And also take a couple seconds to also read off the Indigenous lands that you're seeing people calling in from as well. Okay, thank you. So one of the questions that I like to present at every presentation is, can one Indigenous person speak for all Indigenous peoples? So take the next couple of seconds to, reply to this question. Can one Indigenous person speak for all Indigenous peoples? Yes, no, or not sure? So yes, one person cannot speak for all Indigenous peoples because we're different. If it helps to understand why we're different, it's important to tie it back to our creation stories. So many Indigenous communities have different creation stories that kind of detail how our ancestors were created from the local native plants and animals that were nearby our communities. We also see how these creation stories kind of remove ourselves from these monolithic discourses that make us all the same. And it's also important, right, to acknowledge that even as Indigenous peoples from the same communities, we have different intersectionalities. So we're not all the same and we're different from one another. So, going back to this, Indigenous identities are place-based, and obviously our environments and local landscapes determine our knowledge and relationships. However, as Indigenous peoples, we're treated as a monolithic community because it makes it easier for Western cultures to consume our cultures, right? And I think that's important to acknowledge capitalism and how it taught everyone that our cultures, but only from the past, were meant for consumption. We're ignoring Indigenous peoples of those cultures and our present and futures, even today. So we will still witness these things in many spaces. So today I want like to challenge everyone in the audience to think beyond Indigenous communities as being a monolithic and acknowledging how we're different as well, especially when speaking about relationships. So in this presentation, I will be centering lived experiences. I like to remind the audience that while they can see me, hear me, and stand with me, if you had the opportunity to learn about racism instead of experiencing it, you have a privilege, right? A privilege that as Indigenous peoples, we're not afforded or granted. While this space is open to anyone, lived experiences are going to be centered in my presentation. So getting to know everyone in this virtual space. This being said, I would like to open the space to get to know one another, everyone who's joining us in this virtual space. So if I were to introduce myself into 2 or 3 short phrases, I will say that I'm an Indigenous scientist, community advocate, and author. My first book, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science, was actually published this past January of this year, 2022. So now I would like to make room for the audience to also introduce themselves into 2 or 3 short phrases. And it's important for us to know that we're welcoming one another into this space while making room for our identities and lived experiences while centering those lived experiences. So take the next couple of seconds to introduce yourself into 2 or 3 short phrases. And I will put a timer for this. So we have an Indigenous environmental educator in the audience, an Indigenous ally and student, an Indigenous librarian, a farm worker labor organizer. So thank you all for joining today. Okay, so thank you for introducing yourselves. So today my presentation is talking about relationships. And I think that one of the most important relationships that comes to mind, especially as an Indigenous woman, is the relationship with patriarchy and matriarchy and how those have manifested in my lived experiences. So I come from the Zapotec Nation, which consists of several pueblos, but in my pueblo, we're known to be one of the stronger ones that follows a matriarchal society to the core. So the Zapotec Nation is one of the only few remaining indigenous matriarchal societies, as noted by many people, which I think is important to mention how settler colonialism changed that for many of our indigenous communities. But in my maternal community, women and muses, which are a third gender, get to speak first, get to lead our households and make decisions for our community. Also, our women are the ones that provide the economic revenue, the money, right, for our families and communities because our men tend to rely more on fishing and farming, while as indigenous women, we rely more on our artesanias, which are artisanal items that we make, whether it be our huipiles and our jewelry as, a matriarchal society. So, what is a matriarchal society? So, I usually tell people that it's the opposite of a patriarchal society, the societies that we currently live in, where a social system in which women and our muses, our third gender, hold the primary power positions in roles of authority. So, in the broader sense, it can also extend to moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. So, usually, to give you a visual, when we're speaking in our pueblo, our women get to speak first. And then, after all of our women and muses have spoken, then it's the men's turn to speak. So we can see how that differs in many of our communities. So when speaking about our economy, like other markets outside of our pueblo in Mexico, Oaxaca, um, the women, the vendors tend to be the women. We're also the public figures, the organizers, and it's interesting because it's been accounted that men do not feel oppressed under a matriarchal society, but within Mexico as a whole, there's rarely any woman represented. So we see how patriarchy is manifested outside of our pueblo. So when I talk about the relationships that I learned, is like I feel like I lived in a bubble when I was in my pueblo, because matriarchy gave women the power, but outside of my pueblo, men, especially cisgender men, were given the forms of authority as patriarchy is manifested. So this ties back to the relationships that we have with our lands, right? And how patriarchy impacts our relationship with our landscapes, where land is seen as a property. And this ultimately translates to the way women and two-spirit or muses relatives are treated. And I think, again, going back to our lands are often referred as feminine, right? That's why we refer to them as Mother Earth or Mother Nature. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that, especially in the recent times that we're living in today. So, navigating my upbringing in my maternal community and experiencing patriarchy outside of my community allow me to foster the relationships with the work I do to uplift Indigenous women and muses in the environmental discourse. And I think that this comes to mind the reminder of my grandmother. And I think that's important to acknowledge that, many elders from our communities have a form of saying this as well, because, usually our elders hold those stronger relationships with our environments. So, as my grandmother always told me, when all men learn how to respect a woman, they will also learn how to respect the most powerful of them all, and that's Mother Earth. And I think that it's important to acknowledge those relationships, right? Especially as a Indigenous woman living in a settler society. So, going beyond patriarchy, I also would like to acknowledge the relationships I have for being an Indigenous woman in a settler society, and how I have to navigate, the stereotypes, romanticization, and this consumerism that impacts our communities that are all manifested from settler colonialism. So I think that's important to push back against the dominant narrative, whereas Indigenous peoples, right, our cultures are kind of basically placed in boxes for the Western or non-Indigenous audience or community members to consume. And I think that, this is one of the main reasons why in the environmental discourse, we continue to see how Indigenous peoples are seen as areas of expertise or research subjects rather than experts ourselves or the researchers. So one of the questions that it's important for us to keep in mind is, how do we push against this relationship that has become the norm in our field of study, especially for those of us who are in the environmental sciences or in the sciences overall, right? Where we have to push against Indigenous peoples being seen as areas of expertise and research subjects, when in reality, right, we have those relationships, that knowledge to uphold our own research and center our lived experiences. So we know that, right, the way that our Indigenous cultures are continued to be consumed and why we're treated as research subjects or areas of expertise goes back to this pristine myth, right? Where when settlers saw our environments, they labeled them as pure wilderness and unspoiled, while forgetting to acknowledge the relationships that as Indigenous peoples, especially our ancestors, were able to sustain with our landscapes to steward and caretake for them as well. And of course, calling out the stereotype of the ecological noble savage. That is how indigenous peoples are portrayed to be like these mystical creatures, right? Where we're prancing and dancing with nature, while forgetting to acknowledge that this stereotype came about because settlers could not comprehend the relationships we had with our environments and continue to have, right? So oftentimes in the environmental discourse, it's important for us to find a balance and call out the stereotypes. So if you see yourself kind of thinking of indigenous peoples as these mystical creatures, especially as you go on in the conference, call yourself out and reflect on why is that's the case, right? Especially knowing that many indigenous communities have been displaced from our ancestral homelands and had to reclaim our relationships with nature, right, as a result of displacement. So for me, it's important, right, knowing that I'm an Indigenous woman in the environmental sciences, to find a balance, to keep in mind that, as Indigenous peoples, there's still this stereotype that it's amplified as the ecological noble savage. And how do we foster breaking that stereotype that ends up harming our communities to find that balance and uplift our relationships with our environments? So my relationships with my landscapes and environments were shaped by being displaced. So I would like to, give you a visual of where I come from. So I come from the coastal indigenous pueblo in Oaxaca in the Zapotec Nation, where we rely on fishing and our waters. So the heart kind of gives you the visual of where my community is located. My paternal lands are in El Salvador. So my Maya Chorti community was separated by three settler borders, now known as Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And the heart kind of shows you how our communities are one of those border communities that were separated by three settler borders that were created in our lands. So, being raised as a displaced Indigenous woman, I never forgot that I was displaced, right? And I would like to welcome my grandmother into this virtual space, especially her teaching. So, she always told me to never forget that anywhere I go, that it's not my home, it's someone's home. And you must pay them respect and build relationships with the land and the people to be welcome into their home. Otherwise, you're walking into their home as an unwelcome guest. And I think that in relations to understanding the relationships that we have with indigenous lands and peoples, it's important to question whether we are welcome guests or unwelcome guests. And I think that as indigenous peoples, we have to navigate how do we build those relationships with not just the land, but also the people so that we can be welcome into their homes, right? Because their lands are their homes as well. So this teaching that my grandmother instilled in me made me ensure that I did not forget that I have the responsibility to build those relationships with not just the indigenous lands, but also the indigenous peoples of those lands to ensure I became a welcome guest. And for many of those who, inherit the role of settlers, this may never happen or it will become a lifelong journey. So I think that, going back to, tying it to the presentation we had this morning, it's important to ensure that we understand our roles on indigenous lands, whether we're occupying or settled in them, or we are still navigating them as an unwelcome guest as indigenous peoples who have been displaced. So we have to understand that indigenous lands were stolen and sold to non-indigenous peoples, right? And how that's still manifested today as a result of settler colonialism. So questioning how we foster these relationships with indigenous lands and peoples, right, obviously is going back to the land back movement, where everyone plays a role in this movement that aims to allow indigenous peoples to regain the autonomy to steward and caretake of their lands, right? But oftentimes those of us who are in power and privileged due to our positionalities, we don't want to remove ourselves from those systems that grant us power. So we are not really having those conversations about the land back movement. So tying it back to relationships, especially to relationships to my indigenous communities, this is when I'm gonna bring my father into this virtual space, because they tie back to, his story ties back to our indigenous lands and why it led to our displacement and why it continues to lead to our people's displacement, especially as we speak today. So this is because we have a strong relationship with our environments. These relationships with the systems that manage these environments, especially in agriculture, are oppressive towards indigenous peoples. So in my paternal lands of Central America, there's a commodification of many monocultural systems that produce plantations, right? So we see coffee, bananas, avocados, most of the imports that we get from Central America continue to rely on this monocultural system known as plantations. So going back to this relationship that we have with our natural resources, they have been commodified, right? Because we're living in these capitalistic societies that teach us to consume natural resources as opposed to seeing them as our relatives, right? When it comes to relations and all my relations. So I wanted to ask the audience, what is your current relationship with coffee? And take the next seconds to describe it. And I think that, I'm going to show the nuances that go beyond relationships. So state, what is your relationship with coffee currently? So it's a daily bias. It's intense. Some of you don't drink coffee, so you don't have a relationship. It's medicinal. It's a routine. It's comforting. You use it when you need it. It's a daily essential. Okay. So thank you for participating. So I think that, it's important to keep that in mind as I go into my presentation. So tying it back to, the next slides that I will be talking about, what do you know about Indigenous Maya people today? So take the next 10 seconds to let us know what you know about Indigenous Maya people or Mayan, if that's how you heard of us before. What do you know about our people? So some of you know us for our beautiful architecture and art, agriculture, not enough, very little, relative little, next to nothing. Insects and bees about our Maya people exploited. Chocolate, yes, cacao was something that we introduced into society. Not much. Okay, so thank you for responding to that. So now when we look at the Mayan people, right? Especially there's this conceived notion that as the Mayan civilization or people, we're extinct. And that's because when we talk about our Mayan civilizations, right, we tend to focus on the past. And I think this kind of fails to acknowledge that our indigenous communities were displaced. We displaced ourselves into different lands throughout Central America. So, as indigenous Maya people, we had to push back with this against this false narrative that continues to claim that we are extinct. So, as a result, many of you don't know much about us because there's still this, narrative that we no longer exist. So I think that's important even for indigenous peoples in the audience to make sure that when you speak about other indigenous communities, you're not eradicating or erasing us from the discourses, right? Especially knowing as an indigenous Maya woman that there's the stereotype, right, that we are no longer existing in this world. So this belief about being extinct allowed our settler governments to pretend that, we didn't exist or to not grant us our rights. So when we look at Guatemala in 2010, that's when they first adopted indigenous rights into the constitution. So that's only 12 years ago. When we look at El Salvador, where my communities are currently located, we were not integrated in our recognition until 2014. But, in throughout Central America, there are over 31 Maya groups that, still live there today. And I think that's important to mention that our lands were sold through land grabs to large international monoculture agricultural corporations that introduced these plantations, right? And I'm going to tie it back to coffee and how coffee played a role in the genocide that was disguised as the Central American Civil War. So one of them being coffee plantations continues to play a huge role in our displacement, especially as indigenous Maya people and how we continue to, experience displacement. So tying it back to our, our really recent histories, during the 1920s, coffee plantations had taken all over El Salvador, where most of our lands were sold so that, these international agricultural corporations could produce coffee. And many of the coffee that we still consume today comes from our lands. So, looking at the coffee plantations, landowners employ indigenous communities, but our indigenous communities were never paid. We were rather paid with tortillas and beans, which are very low cost foods. So, this allowed the owners to gather as much profit as they could, and nothing was being done to call out this injustice, especially as it pertained to indigenous labor. So, our people were not taught how to steward these plantations, right? Because we inherited those relationships through our traditional ecological knowledge on how to steward and caretake for our environments. So as a result, the indigenous communities of Central America, especially the indigenous Maya communities, got tired of being exploited and started to form indigenous resistance movements to go against this oppression. So when we look at the Central American government, they, started claiming that these groups wanted to spread communism. So obviously, both settler governments from Canada and the United States jumped quickly to aid the Central American governments with weapons and other kind of training that wanted, that violent training that wanted to foster a fear among our indigenous communities so that we didn't actually resist or go against these oppressive government systems. And unfortunately, right, this also included La Gran Matanza, which is a military-led massacre against indigenous peoples and peasants, mostly Nahua people in El Salvador, that took place. And I think that's important to acknowledge that, this Gran Matanza or Great Massacre took place on January 22, 1932, which is not that long ago when you think about it. And this massacre was led by the government due to the social unrest and fear that was growing in our country. So our indigenous men were targeted and killed off during, these oppositions, especially as they were trying to oppress indigenous resistance groups or diminish them from growing. So as a result, both the government and the guerrilla, the indigenous resistance movement, had to move themselves to start recruiting children, especially indigenous children, because they either wanted to infiltrate the resistance movement and make the indigenous children fight against their own people, or if you were a child, you had to choose what side to fight in. So unfortunately, we had a lot of our indigenous children becomes child soldiers in this Central American Civil War. And one of those indigenous child soldiers was my father, who was forced to join the war at the age of 11 years old. So tying it back to the entire presentation, right? So in relation to my father's story and the role it had in the war, right? Him being an indigenous, child, especially coming from a low socioeconomic class, kind of forced him to join such violent and brutal wars, right? So as an indigenous boy, he did not have the means to buy a safe ticket out of the country or any protection to fight in the war. So he was only 11 when he was forced to leave his childhood behind in order to survive the war at that young age. So I think that's important to talk about our indigenous children and how oftentimes genocide targets our indigenous children, because our indigenous children are our seeds to our future, and they're the ones who are going to sustain our relationships as we move forward in this landscape and society. So oftentimes we see how settler governments continue to target our indigenous children. So when we talk about when the Civil War actually ended, historians have accounted that in Guatemala, the Civil War ended in December 29, 1996. And in El Salvador, the Civil War ended in January 16, 1992. So when we talk about when it ended, these, years are not that far along from the present. So I also want to give a content warning, as I'm also going to talk about Indigenous children's death. So, if this is a hard topic for you, especially centering lived experiences, feel free to mute this part of the presentation or remove yourself at this time. So, this Central American Civil War targeted our indigenous children. So we are still trying to recover the unmarked graves of our indigenous children who were murdered during the Central American Civil Wars. A lot of our children went missing, and this history is very present in our lives, right? So when we talk about relationships, we have to talk about the relationships that we were forced to have as a result of genocide, and this genocide enacted against our indigenous children today. So unfortunately, we continue to see how our children's death are manifested at the border, right? And I think that within the United States framework, even though we are indigenous peoples from different Mayan nations, our people continue to be labeled as Latinx or Hispanic. So we are denied many of our indigenous rights, including access to our native languages, right? And many of our people, including our children, do not know how to speak Spanish, which is our colonial languages, but within these immigration frameworks, because we're Latinx or Hispanic, we're denied access to our native languages, and as a result of that, this has led to the death of our indigenous children, and also because of the immigration discourses, right, and how displacement coming from south of the border is criminalized as a result of that. So I wanted to read off this statement from the International Mayan League, especially our, Juanita Cabrera, who's our executive director, and she kind of outlines the indigenous children's death that we have experienced in this present time. So since December 2018, there have been at least 5 Maya children and one young Maya woman who have died in the United States-Mexico border under U.S. custody or killed by federal officials. Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez from the Mayan Nation, 20 years old, was shot in the head by a Custom Borders Patrol agent in Texas on May 23, 2018, after crossing the border. Jacqueline Cal McKean from the Maya Quechua Nation, 7 years old, died of a bacterial infection on December 8, 2018. Felipe Gomez Alonso from the Maya Chu Nation, 8 years old, died on Christmas Eve 2018 of flu complications. Juan de Leon Gutierrez, a child from a Maya Chorti Nation, 16 years old, died on April 30, 2019 from a brain infection caused by an untreated sinus infection. Wilmer Josue Ramirez Vasquez, also from a Maya Chorti Nation, 2.5 years old, died of pneumonia on May 16, 2019. And Carlos Gregorio Hernandez Vasquez from the Maya Achi Nation, 16 years old, died on May 20, 2019 after a influenza diagnosis. So it's important to kind of mention how when we are talking about how indigenous communities are impacted, is usually our indigenous women and indigenous children who are impacted, right? And this relationship to displacements, especially from indigenous people south of the border, we're criminalized within the immigration discourse, resulting in the death of many of our children and women. So as a result, transnational indigenous solidarities is an important relationship that I foster because we need indigenous communities, especially from this side of the border, to basically also stand in solidarity with us, especially knowing that, oftentimes as indigenous peoples, we're referred to as Latinx or Hispanic, especially coming from those, south of the border. So, it's also not saying that everybody who embodies the ethnicity of being Latinx or Hispanic is indigenous, because that's not the case. But I think that when we talk about relationships, it's important to also foster transnational indigenous solidarities as well. So seeing how our relationships with nature have to be reclaimed by our people who are displaced in order for them to heal, right? So going back to the healing our indigenous landscapes, many of our people, even if you have encountered internal displacement within settler borders or external displacement across settler borders, you had to reclaim your relationship with nature and our new environments, especially as we undergo this ecological grief, right? Which results from the displacement and loss of having our ancestral homelands near or being able to live in them, right? So we have to kind of heal from this relationship that has been fractured as a result of being displaced, because we have to reclaim those relationships and heal from the ecological grief. So important relationship with nature. So I think that when I talk about my father and my experiences, one of the teachings that my father taught me, and is one of the greatest relationships that I sustain today as an indigenous person, is that this relationship that states that nature protects us as long as we protect nature. So I wanted to ask the audience also to, allow you to bring yourself into this space. How strongly does this teaching align with the actions, not your beliefs, but the actions you take today? Nature protects us as long as we protect nature. So take the next 30 seconds to kind of let us know where your relationship with this teaching actually manifests in your life today. Okay, so we have an average of 4.2. And I think that the way that this teaching actually manifests in my relationships with nature has been fostered through the relationships with an invasive species, right? That is considered to be an invasive species in El Salvador, my paternal lands. But for us, we refer to invasive species as displaced relatives. And I think that I wanted to recount the story of the banana tree and how this story kind of manifested the teaching that my father instilled in me, that nature protects us as long as we protect nature. So when my father was recruited to join the war, in his guerrilla encampment, which was the opposition group against the government, there was this banana tree. So my father, at the age of 11, he kind of used this banana tree to be his shield from, from his harsh reality. It was his playground. He had befriended this banana tree. He would climb up this banana tree whenever he wanted bananas, right? Because that was their food source, especially knowing that the guerrilla wasn't given any support, especially given that everything went to the military, right? Because of the fear of communism. So 3 years into the war, when he was 14, his guerrilla encampment was located by the government, the military, and it was bombarded. So my father's first instinct was to run under this banana tree because he had built a relationship with, and obviously the bombs being dropped kind of manifested a harsh reality that he kind of wanted to escape. So when he rushed under the banana tree, he saw a bomb falling on top of the banana tree. So he thought, he was going to lose his life because this was the end. But when the bomb dropped on the banana tree, instead of it igniting, the banana trees, the leaves kind of wrapped themselves in a way that prevented the bomb from igniting. So I think that, fostering my father's teaching, nature protects you as long as you protect nature, he protected this tree and also built a strong relationship with this tree. And as a result, even though banana trees are invasive species, it became his displaced relative that protected him because he had protected that tree. So I think that, coming into the present context, especially when we talk about relationships with our environments, we cannot ignore to talk about climate change, especially as we're talking about healing our indigenous landscapes as a result of climate change. So when we talk about climate change and indigenous peoples, we know we are known to, face 5 inequities. The first inequity being the degree of responsibility for climate change that as indigenous peoples we have. The second inequity being the impact of climate change, especially from the global south, which, includes Latin America. The third inequity is ability and capacity to deal with the impacts of climate change. We know that when we talk about mitigation and adaptation efforts, indigenous communities are not the ones that are supported, especially by settler governments. Inequity number 4 is the intergenerational impacts of climate change, especially if your community has been displaced or has, experienced some form of displacement. And inequity number 5 is the gender disparities that exist in climate change. And despite indigenous peoples having a role, being identified to play a strong role, in combating climate change, they're rarely considered in public discourses on climate change. So we're seeing how this administration is starting to uplift traditional ecological knowledge, but obviously there's more to do than just acknowledging, right? We also have to take action. So I feel like for this administration, they're in the acknowledgement phases, right? We tie it back to land acknowledgements. They're acknowledging traditional ecological knowledge, but they also have to hold responsibilities and accountabilities to take actions, to also foster, those actions that will enact justice in our communities. And I think that's important for us, especially when we talk about relationships and transnational relationships, to understand and acknowledge that 50% of the world's biodiversity is currently located in what is known as in Latin America, right? So as indigenous people south of the border, we are sustaining 50% of the world's biodiversity. And we see the ongoing impacts of genocide coupled with environmental resistance movements and how they contribute to the ongoing displacement of our indigenous peoples, especially from Central America. And I think that's important for us to foster those relationships, especially when we talk about indigenous knowledge and healing. So going back to indigenous peoples, what I refer to as indigenous science is what many people refer to as traditional ecological knowledge. And the reason why I personally prefer to use the word indigenous science is because oftentimes in many scientific spaces, when we mention traditional ecological knowledge, and feel free to let me know whether this has been your experience, scientists fixate more on the traditional aspects, right? So they continue to refer to indigenous peoples as the past tense while ignoring our present and indigenous futures. And what I usually like to tell scientists is that indigenous science is looking at the completed puzzle piece, a puzzle, as opposed to Western science is only focusing on two or three puzzle pieces. So when we talk about why indigenous peoples have that knowledge in combating climate change, is because we look at the world in a more holistic lens. Obviously, it's important to center local indigenous communities of the environments that we're trying to heal and mitigate as we continue to experience climate change impacts. In Western sciences, right, even in the ways that even our indigenous cultures, as mentioned before, we're placed in boxes, right? So Western science tends to put everything into boxes. So when we talk about conservation, especially of animal species, we tend to focus on one animal species as opposed to looking at the entire landscape. So throughout this conference, you're going to learn about other indigenous scientists, and I want you to start formulating how they're looking beyond boxes and looking at the complete puzzle pieces, as opposed to how Western science manifests itself in today's relationship, especially when it comes up to healing our indigenous landscapes. So before I end this presentation, right, I always like to allow people to reflect on the actions they can take. So which relationship came to mind during this presentation that you feel you have to foster or strengthen as a person? So I'm going to give you a minute to answer this question, and just reflect and also try to keep yourselves accountable. And then we're going to read out some responses, and then we're going to move into the Q&A section of this presentation. So we see relationships with local tribes, between my workplace and the local tribes, educate others, professional connections and governments with local indigenous communities, cedar tree, river medicinal plants and berries. Connection to your ancestors, history, and their relationship to land. Knowledge and relationship with local indigenous communities. Being more vocal when in a position to support indigenous peoples, with myself and lost connections to Mother Nature. Okay. Yeah, so thank you for participating, and I hope that you learned something from this presentation. So I would also like to thank all the conference and the summit organizers, and thank you for having me here today. So now I'm going to pass the mic to.
Thank you for that fantastic presentation, Dr. Hernandez. We'll open up the session for any Q&A if anyone has any questions.
Jessica, I'm going to ask a question while other folks are thinking of the questions that they're going to ask. So first thing, folks, if you can funnel your questions into the Q&A chat instead of the actual chat box, that would be great. My question for Dr. Hernandez is, what inspires you to continue doing the work that you do and to do all the amazing science and to write the books and to have the voice that you have?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'm also looking forward to your book. And I think that's, we are in a current time period where we have the opportunities to write our own stories and tell our own stories instead of our stories written or told for us. And I think that this, we think we owe that to the previous generations that have pushed against, this settler dominant narrative that continues to tell our stories and write our stories. And I think that knowing that oftentimes the responsibility, especially when it comes to addressing climate change, falls on the youth. As someone who is still in that generation, it's important to kind of push back on that responsibility to, everyone in this society, because everybody plays a role in healing our landscapes and also making sure that they allow and make room for indigenous peoples to also heal, because oftentimes our landscapes and environments also carry our trauma, but they can also carry our healing. So how do we foster those dialogues to push back even further and peel another layer of settler colonialism, especially knowing that for so many years our stories have been told for us and we're still continue to be treated as research subjects or areas of expertise, especially in the environmental sciences. So I think that it's that responsibility that comes within our generation, but also kind of putting that responsibility back on everyone else who always kind of claims that the youth give them hope, right? Because we are going to get tired, and it's important for us to also take care of ourselves, especially from our generation. Thank you for your question.
Okay, we have another question. What are adequate ways to combine traditional and modern indigenous knowledge in working with the land?
I think that, it's important to localize that question to the local environment. So if we're talking about Seattle, working with the Coast Salish people, the Duwamish people, and asking them what are the protocols for them to combine traditional, their traditional knowledge with Western or modern science. And I think that one of the ways to do that is to, be open to learning and also being open to stepping back, especially because, as scientists, we're taught to come up with this research experiment or research project without consulting the indigenous peoples or asking them if this will actually benefit them. So moving away from that helicopter research, right, where we design the projects without consulting the indigenous peoples before we design those projects, and ensuring that we make room for them to push back and also for them to also teach us, especially as scientists who have a lot of unlearning and relearning that we have to do. So I would say, make sure to localize that question to your local environments and talk to your local indigenous communities of those lands. Thank you for your question.
We have a few more questions. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but can you explain more about the displaced relatives example and how Western science views invasive species?
Yeah, so one of the things is that we can see how settlers and Western scientists no longer have a relationship with nature like we as Indigenous peoples do. And oftentimes, one of the things that, my father and my elders always told me was that invasive species are actually displaced relatives, right? Whether, while they might not be necessarily our relatives to our lands, they're someone's relatives. But when we look at restoration projects, oftentimes people who are descended from these displaced relatives kind of aggressively treat invasive species, right? Where they're trying to get the work done, they remove them without, asking for their permission, building that relationship or connection with the invasive species. So one of the things that I usually promote, especially when doing land restoration work, is that for settlers who are, who are descended from Europe or have any ancestry there, and they're kind of removing an invasive species, to look beyond it just being an invasive species, right? Because they often are labeled as pests, unwanted, weeds, and to see them as their displaced relatives, right? Because it's important to acknowledge that a lot of the invasive species were introduced to our lands during colonization. And I think looking back at my father's story and seeing how the banana tree is an invasive species and how it became a displaced relative as we consume bananas today, as we kind of incorporated them even in our traditional foods like our tamales. We use banana leaves, plantains to cook a lot of our traditional dishes. How do we foster those relationships to also build, strong relationships with invasive species that we see as displaced relatives, and pushing back on settlers and Western scientists to acknowledge that they have been taught because of settler colonialism to remove themselves from nature, right? So oftentimes when I ask people, rate your relationship with nature, they say really strong, but when it comes to, their displaced relatives, they continue to treat them as invasive species without accounting for reclaiming those relationships. So thank you for your question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Where do you see opportunities for building solidarity across Indigenous communities and nations that have been lumped under Hispanic or Latinx, where Indigenous erasure persists? The Caribbean, South, Central America, and diaspora communities.
I think that one of the ways is to learn the history, right? So when we talk about Christopher Columbus, we often kind of associate Christopher Columbus to landing in the Americas, but we forget that he landed in the Caribbean, and the Caribbean being a part of Latin America. So I think that's important to acknowledge that there are Indigenous communities, especially the International Mayan League, who I work with, that are kind of pushing against this dominant narrative that is continuing to label Indigenous communities as Latinx or Hispanic, where in reality that's an ethnicity. And even within our own countries, we have these racial structures that make it obvious who's Indigenous. While we don't have tribal sovereignty or tribal enrollments, we have that Indigenous sovereignty that we continue to fight and persist to maintain. And I think that's important to learn the histories. It's also important to learn the histories behind these ethnicity frameworks, especially when it comes to Latinx and Hispanic people, because there are different racial structures, but Latinidad as a framework continues to erase Indigenous peoples, Black Latinos, and also Afro-Indigenous peoples, when in reality, it's important to acknowledge how those who are within that framework can also be oppressors, especially going back to our lands, right? But I guess because they're often seen as people of color, which, obviously under these racial frameworks in the United States, that's true. They forget their positionality when it comes to whiteness in Latin America. So learning more from Indigenous scholars from those regions will be a great way to understand those narratives, and also looking at organizations like the International Mayan League and seeing how they're pushing against this narrative, especially when it comes to displacement of Indigenous Mayan people in the United States and Canada as well. Thank you for your question.
Cool. We have quite a few questions here, but why do you think so many Indigenous peoples think they have to reject science as an approach to addressing their issues?
So one of the things that I like to remind everyone is that even within the Western sciences, there are Indigenous contributions, whether they're indirect or direct. So for instance, when we look at navigation, right, for those of us who study marine sciences or oceanography, navigation is often kind of given credit to European navigators, when in reality, even European navigations, they, borrow a lot of artifacts or tools from indigenous communities, whether it be from indigenous communities in Africa or indigenous communities in the Middle East. But when it comes to navigation, right, they're often, the white men are usually the pioneers or the founders of those systems. So there's a point in time in Western societies, especially Western sciences, when sciences became ahistorical, acultural, and apolitical, right? So free from politics, free from culture, free from any histories. And as a result of that, science tends to be objective and dismiss indigenous ways of knowing, when in reality, as even as indigenous peoples, we directly contributed to those Western science frameworks. So looking at navigation, we also see how the indigenous peoples from the Polynesian islands also were leading navigation, exploration efforts, and a lot of the science that they use was kind of borrowed by European navigators to navigate, the oceans as well. But yet, when it comes to navigation, indigenous knowledges are dismissed. So I think that oftentimes we're placed to be in contradicting to one another, when in reality, when we look at Western sciences and we start looking at the historical nuances or histories behind those concepts, we can find some indigenous contributions, whether they were indirectly or directly embedded in those philosophies. So I think that it's because Western science is now seen as ahistorical, apolitical, and a cultural, that we are, coming in tension with Western sciences, when in reality, even some of our, cultural beliefs kind of were integrated in the founding of those disciplines or concepts, and navigation being one example of many. Thank you for that question.
Great, awesome, thank you so much. That wraps up this session. We're gonna prepare for the next